I'm just sharing my screen again, and what should have come up for you all is one of the InFocus classroom or lecture halls that we like to use for our presentations. And for those of you new to us, I know there's plenty of you new on the webinar today. We use a tool called Prezi. It's an alternative to PowerPoint, and it allows us to jump a bit around the screen. So for example, just to go through what we'll be covering in today's webinar, we'll be going through an introduction to the presenters and also an introduction to the knowledge exchange, the project that these webinars belong to. We'll then be looking at just what is advocacy, how to advocate, and finally, different lenses and value propositions that you can use to advocate for inclusive sport. So our first webinar last month was all about what is an inclusive activity and what is inclusive sport. Today, it's all about how to then advocate at different levels for inclusive sport. And so this is what we'll be covering, but it won't be one long presentation. We'll be bringing you in at various points. We'll be using polls to ask you different questions. We'll be asking you to join in exercises as well, if you want to. And so hopefully it'll be also quite interactive for you all, and we'll get some good discussion and good input out of it as well. And as a starting point, I wanted to go a bit further to introduce myself and Amy, our guest presenter. And Amy, if we could start with you, if that's okay, if you could just tell us a bit about yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Amy Farkas Karageorgis. I am currently working for myself as part of Inclusion for Development. Previously, I've worked for the International Paralympic Committee, UNICEF, and the United States National Center on Physical Activity and Disability. My background is basically in inclusive development and sport for development, and I'm very pleased to be with you today.
Great, thank you, Amy. And thank you also for taking the time and all the time to prepare for this as well. It's really much appreciated. And if I just give a very brief introduction to myself as well, I'm a co-founder and a senior consultant at InFocus, and I have over 11 years of experience as a evaluator, a trainer, and a consultant, and I mainly support not-for-profit organizations with evaluation and learning activities and support. And I've worked in over 30 countries to do that, and a big part of my role and part of our social enterprise remit at InFocus is to run these kinds of knowledge sharing webinars, which you could probably tell as we go through this, we really enjoy doing. It's quite inspiring to hear from all of you from around the world. And I've worked in the field of sport for development for over 10 of those, more than 11 years, but I'm relatively new still to the topic of sport for development and disability. So I often in these webinars have questions myself, really coming from more of a beginner's perspective, and I do defer to my much more experienced colleagues, but I'm really enjoying learning about this area. So my role is as a facilitator here and an expert in evaluation theory of change, less so in terms of disability, but I'm learning all the time. And it's a good point to just also mention our wider team who've been very kindly, and again, everybody is doing this as on a pro bono basis, and this is our wider team that have been behind the knowledge exchange that we'll describe in a moment. So Catherine Carty, Eli Wolf, and Sneh Gupta are all on the call. I know Eli has a prior commitment and needs to jump off at some point, but it may well be, especially in a Q&A, that our wider team will come in and also add some value into the call as well. So again, thank you to the whole team for putting this together, and you may well hear from all of us at some point throughout the call. So having introduced our presenters, what I wanted to do was just to give you a bit of background to the Sport for Development or Sport and Disability Knowledge Exchange. I think we seem to keep changing the title slightly. So this is a project to which these webinars belong, and we do this on every webinar, so it's a bit repetitive for those of you who've been on here before. You're welcome to take a couple of minutes and get a cup of tea or do something else, because this is what we go through at the start of every webinar, because we do have new people join every time. So the background to this webinar was that in 2016 and 17, we were running a Laureate Sport for Good learning community with 6 organizations from around the world to look at sport for development and disability, and look at the common areas and differences in approaches around the world. And so we wanted to continue that this year as in focus. And so what we did was to put in place 6 different webinars this year. The first 2 are a bit more close together because we started a bit later in preparing for this, but generally they're every 2 months. And so the idea was to take a different topic related to sport and disability, and to get a guest speaker in, and to have exercises and engage you all on different topics across the year. And Amy did point out that I think our November date, the 23rd, coincides with Thanksgiving in the US, so we will be actually changing the November date slightly. Otherwise, we're trying to keep these in place, and we set the topics as we go. But likely now, with a bit of a break before the next one, we'll try and see if we can set the next 3, and give a bit of leeway for you all to join. The objectives of the knowledge exchange are to explore different topics related to sport for disability and sport for development and disability through discussions and exercises and presentations. And we're really interested, we're not here to lecture on what is good practice. We're not here to tell you how to do anything, and I really hope that doesn't come across that way. We're interested in putting across different work that's taking place in this area, and really understanding what are the common elements, the differences in your area, and do you disagree with what we're presenting? Is there something we're missing? We're getting a lot of value out of feedback from you all into these different webinars. And the end product is to develop a new theory of change for this area. So out of the Laureate Sport for Good project in 2016 and 17, we developed a draft theory of change for disability in sport. And I've been updating this just over the past few weeks, and we're going to have a new version of it ready for the next webinar. And we have a 2-month break in effect to share with you all. So each of these webinars is about expanding and developing this theory of change a bit further. So it's not just some hopefully interesting discussions. There's a document that will emerge from this, and we're also looking at the potential to pull together the different findings into a journal article as well at the end of this. And so terminology, this is my final point before we have a quick look at the agenda, and then I pass over to Amy. It's really key that we just give you an idea of where the terminology we use comes from, and that relates both to sport for development and to disability. So for disability, we're taking our definitions mainly from the CRPD, and so the main thing to mention here is that we're using the term persons with disabilities, or person with a disability instead of disabled people. And I realize that's different in different countries around the world. We had to go for something, so we've gone for the CRPD definition, but I do realize it can be different depending on where you are around the world. And finally, for sport for development, we've gone for this definition here, that we're mainly concerned with the intentional use of sport, physical activity to have a social objective in effect. But we do welcome anybody really working in the field of sport and disability. But this tends to be the definition that we use. And so there is that distinction between sport development and sport for development that we've taken here from Jutta from the Swiss Academy for Development. And so sport development being primarily about developing sport and a certain sport, and sport for development being more about those social outcomes. But we don't, we're not, we're mainly focused on sport for development, but we do welcome anybody from the sport and disability field onto these webinars. But hopefully that adds a little bit of clarity about terminology. And now, finally, just to give you an idea, and we'll just zoom in here, of our agenda for today. So we're just at the point, I think I'm just about on time, I think, hopefully, but just going through our introduction to the webinar, the presenters and the agenda. We're then going to go into a 10-minute presentation from Amy about what is advocacy. We then got some questions to ask you all, and an open question as well, where we're looking for some feedback. Then we have another presentation from Amy on how to advocate. We then have our centerpiece exercise, where we're going to ask you all for some ideas on how to advocate for inclusive sport, and maybe what you've done before in that area. We then present our arguments that our team has come up with for different lenses, different ways of looking at advocating for inclusive sport. And then we've got a final open question, and then we have a half-hour Q&A. So we stay on for half an hour to answer any questions you might have. And we're going to start by answering some of the questions that have come through, some really great questions that came through before the webinar from you all. So that's the plan for today. Really hoping that you can all also engage in the exercise as well. You don't have to, but we certainly encourage it. And so at this point, it'd be great to stop hearing from me and to come over to Amy. And Amy, I'm just going to pass over control to you and then step away from my keyboard.
That's fantastic, Tom. Thank you so much. I'm just waiting to see that I have control, and then I'll begin. Fantastic. I think I'm in control, so let me know if I'm not. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. This is one of my favorite topics, and I look forward to sharing what I know about it, and also bringing in all the colleagues that are part of these webinars, and also all of you on the call today. I'd like to start by saying that essentially we all are doing advocacy, and I'd like to acknowledge that and say thank you for doing that. Disability sport, inclusive sport, sport for development, all of that takes a lot of advocacy. So thank you for doing it. Let's look at the differences between activism and advocacy, as they are really often confused. Let's start with activism. This is really the intentional action to bring about social change, political change, economic justice, or environmental well-being. And what this could look like, just to give you some examples, it could be participating in protests or making public statements. It could be through social media. And usually it's in favor of or against major social issues, such as right now, some current ones are Black Lives Matters in the movement in the United States. We also have a major one in the US about gun control. More internationally, marriage equality is a big one. And then also closer to home on the topic of this webinar would be, for example, rights for all, which is speaking up and advocating for the rights of all people with disabilities worldwide. If we move on to advocacy to see the difference, and just to let you know that I'm pausing because I can tell that my computer audio goes very low when the slides are changing. So advocacy is the act of publicly representing an individual, it could be yourself, or an organization or an idea. Now, to be an advocate is to speak and learn about social and political issues and then bring that attention to the injustice or the challenge that's happening. And subsequently, you are aiding the activist, which could be yourself, in the fight against the seeks to ensure that people, computer audio catches up with me. So advocacy really, seeks to ensure that people, those that are the most marginalized or vulnerable, have their voices heard. We want to defend and safeguard their rights, for example. We want to make sure that they have their views and desires considered when decisions are being made about them. So some examples would be advocating for more programs and services. Another one would be advocating for one or more of the principles of universal design, which were discussed on the last webinar, or universal access. Another example of advocacy has to do with the CRPD itself, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As many of you probably know, it was actually purely based on advocacy that the convention came to be, that it was individuals speaking up and asking for new and better policies and legislation at an international level that would recognize and enhance the rights of people with disabilities. So this is a very good example of advocacy. We also have examples where you might want to reform a system, for example, the education system and how children with disabilities receive their education. And it may also be that you want to monitor the implementation of some of these international human rights standards or frameworks, like the CRPD, or another sport example would be the International Convention Against Doping in Sport. All of those are examples of advocacy. So as the slide changes, I would just like to point out that typically we talk about advocacy as being seen as working within the system to generate changes where activism is needed. To just generate change within the system. And then activism separately is often seen as working outside of the system to influence. So although they're different, I would assume that you would agree that both are really necessary in order to create systematic change or systemic change, and that one cannot function without the other. So I'd like to share with you a great quote from a famous activist working here on Black Lives Matters issues. And she says, it's important to recognize that our voices might not always be the one that needs to be elevated. A dialogue cannot occur when everyone in the room is speaking. I hope you take away that there's a need for speaking up, and there's also a need for advocating behind closed doors or within the system or in different modalities and ways that we'll get into later. So as the slide changes, apologies for the delay. I'm trying to change it. Tom, do you happen to have control at the moment? And if so, can you change it?
I don't, but I could take that back and make the changes if that would be better as we go through, because it sounds like it's affecting your audio. So happy to do that if that would work a bit better. We could try that.
I'm just not having, it's not moving.
Okay, I shall take over control and let you focus on the presentation.
All right, great.
First time we tried that, so we won't.
All right.
Okay.
Let's look at why advocacy is important. Can you go there, please? Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so here we are. I mean, we all know now what it is and what differences there are between activism and advocacy. And I'm sure many of you understand it's important. But I think what we need to remind ourselves is that it ensures that the voices of the most marginalized are heard. So while it works within the system and it's a vehicle to create this change that we need on issues or policy or programs or budgets, it's really also about raising the voices of those that are not able to speak for themselves or don't have the platform to speak for themselves. So it is absolutely critical that we all play a role in this. Tom, we'll move on to who can be an advocate. Along the same lines of why we do advocacy is essentially anyone can be an advocate. And the most important aspect is that you're well informed on the issue. So if you're going to speak on behalf of others or yourself on a very specific issue, just make sure that you have your facts lined up. Now, there is always an issue about, or a debate and discussion about whether people without disabilities should be advocating on behalf of people with disabilities. And to that, I would say it's very nice to build coalitions. It's very nice to have both individuals represented to show that we are inclusive and that we do have a community that has both people with and without disabilities within it. So while it's important to have self-advocates speaking on their own behalf, it also doesn't hurt to have community and supporters that will do that alongside them. So let's go on to what are some types of advocacy so that you can see maybe what you're doing or what you could be doing. Great, so you can go one more, Tom. All right, so here we have two major differentiations. We have the macro advocacy, which really works at the systems level, and we have micro advocacy that works at an individual level. As it says here, the macro advocacy or systems change really means looking at policies or programs, practices at various levels, and how to change the situation for individuals who may share those common problems. One example of this would be ensuring that all people with disabilities in a country or in a system would be allowed to participate in school sport programs or in physical education classes. That would be a system-wide advocacy example. So on the flip side, we have micro or individual. Here, it focuses a lot more on a situation that involves one individual, and you want to ensure that you protect their rights, his or her rights. It could be for oneself or it could be on behalf of someone. An example of this would be an individual who would like to join a very specific sport program or sport team and have been excluded until now. So that's an example of the individual or micro. Next slide, please. What we're looking at here is the same thing, but in a Venn diagram, and it adds one level, which doesn't contradict what I just explained, but we thought it would be nice to just show you and have in this recording that there is really sort of the smaller systems, the medium systems, and the larger systems. And that, you know, the reason I didn't describe it just now previously is because it's often easier to look at micro, small, individual versus macro systems. Those are the most common types that you will hear about. But in fact, advocacy happens at all three levels. So for micro, it's really that intra or interpersonal level. For the medium level, this is where you start to get in between the two. You get neighborhoods and schools and communities and groups of people. And then for macro, it's the bigger policy area. So the other thing we can look at is soft versus hard advocacy. Now, soft is really your less strenuous actions or activities, the ones that take a little less effort. So this would be like educating a person about correct terminology or how to talk about inclusive sport and people with disabilities. Hard would be much more strenuous or take more effort. And in that, it would be trying to change a budget or trying to change a policy. So just think about how much soft versus hard advocacy are you doing and at what levels are you doing it? So one more thing that I'd like to look at before we go into some polls is the modalities in which advocacy can happen. You see here 4 different sort of categories or tools or vehicles for such. Writing seems pretty obvious. It could be, you know, opinion pieces in newspapers. It could be writing a letter to a parliamentarian. It could be writing a new policy that you want to get adopted. But really, it's about getting your message across in writing because you know it'll reach a certain audience. Speaking is really about speaking up. It could be both in one-on-one conversation, it could be in large forums, and it leads into what we have here about education, which is, you know, education can really be a tool or a vehicle for advocacy. For example, to educate and inform about the lack of opportunities and access and the need to create more and better opportunities and access can itself be the advocacy, as well as facilitate further advocacy efforts. And finally, we have advocacy or communication campaigns. Campaigns take a wide variety of forms, but it could be, you know, a set of actions that create support for a proposal. It could be a big campaign across the country or a city, on television and social media. There's various forms that these campaigns take, and we're going to get into developing a strategy which could lead to identifying what kind of campaign is best for your situation. So I'm going to hand it over to Tom, who's going to get us through some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. And sorry for the technical challenges there. Just for the group, we were trying something a bit different there where I passed control over to Amy, but I'm not sure how well that worked. So it might be a glitch in the system there. But so Amy, for the next sections, I'll continue on slide duty. And so we had a couple of questions for you all. And I'll just raise these here. So the first we're keen to understand, and we're going to bring this up as what we call a poll. So this will jump up on your screen in a moment for you to answer. We're just keen to understand who in the group has advocated for more inclusive sport based on the definitions for advocacy that we've gone through. And then we have a more open question, just if you have conducted advocacy, if you could type into the question box what issues you were advocating for. And I think we're interested outside of inclusive sport too, if you've conducted advocacy outside of that. It'd be really interesting to know. And I'd open that up also to our organising team as well, to who I know have all been involved in advocacy. But we're going to start actually with the poll. So that's going to come up on your screen any moment now, hopefully. And very simple to take part. You just click on the response that you that most relates to your experience, and I'll go quiet just for, we normally give it about a minute to see if we can get as many people as possible to vote. So I'll be going quiet for about 30 seconds while those come up. Okay, so let's look at some results for that. Give it another 5 seconds if you still want to vote, and then I can bring that up on the screen. So that should jump up any moment. I'm just making it a bit bigger so I can also see it as well. So we've got our results for the poll. It's quite interesting actually. So 56% of those of you who, I think we had 73% voted. 56 had been involved in advocacy before for inclusive sport. 90% had not, and 22% were not sure. So yeah, interesting. We're just over half then who've been involved in advocacy before. I was just thinking for myself, if I have on any particular topic, I'm not convinced I actually have in the past 10 years or so. I couldn't, just based on the definitions we've gone through, I was just trying to challenge myself if that had been part of my role, but I can't think of an occasion where I have actually been involved in it at all. It's very interesting to hear from the group on that. So what we'd now like you to do, so those 56% of you who have been involved in advocacy, particularly with inclusive sport, it'd be great to know if you could type in the question box, just what you're advocating for. It'd be great to understand that from you all, just what your experience has been. So you've got a question box. Hopefully in your panel on the right. It would be great to type that in, and then in a minute or two we'll start to read those out and hear from the group. So what I'll do is give you all a minute just to type those in, and we've already got some great responses coming in. Again, I'd encourage our organising team to put in their responses too, and then we'll start to read them out and find out what you have been engaging with in relation to advocacy. So I will come back in about 30 seconds to a minute's time. Okay, we've got some great responses coming through. I think we've got about 5 or 6 so far. So we're going to start to go through, and for this exercise, we won't type them up on the screen. We're just going to talk through them and give an idea from the group of just what everybody has been involved with. So, what I should say, and I should have said at the outset of this webinar, I really do apologize if I pronounce your name incorrectly. We've got about 40 of us on this webinar. As I mentioned, we've got about 100 registering, and I didn't get a chance to go through and practice any names that I wasn't sure how to pronounce, and I'm quite notorious for getting names wrong. So I do apologize. I mean no offense. People normally find it amusing more than offensive, I think. So hopefully that will be the case again today. But let's go around and read through the responses that we've got, and then I'll pass back to Amy for the second part of the presentation. So if I could go around. So Silvana, first of all, there's a couple of responses from you here. So I'm just going to widen my window here to be able to go through them. So Silvana has been involved with advocating for the right for people with a disability to practice and benefit from any type of sport, and the right for people with a disability to benefit from tourist options in any part of the world in a feasible and fun manner. Brilliant, so thank you, Silvana. From Eli, Eli has advocated for more opportunities and access to sports programs and facilities and more inclusive sport policies. Nermin has advocated for persuading families of children with intellectual disabilities to engage in physical activity. So thank you, Nermin. Laurie has advocated for beach access, mobility impaired hunts, state park accessibility, and program inclusion. And it just a lot of these responses I really want to dig deeper into, because there's some really new things to me here. But we've got our big exercise a bit later, and there we're making arguments in each other. So we should hopefully be able to hear from you, because there's really interesting responses here. From Claire, we've got inclusion through physical activity, not only sport, for persons with disabilities or with health problems via APA community programs, as well as online inclusive coaching sessions. So thank you, Claire. I'm just going down the list. You've a lot of very active advocates in our group. So then Isagal, we've got has advocated for sports for people with disabilities. We've got Israel, who has mentioned he's a sport enthusiast and advocated for an inclusive Paralympic sport in preparation for the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games that ended recently. Additionally, they've been advocating for participatory sporting events with similar incentives for people with disabilities and their non-disabled counterparts. So brilliant, thank you, Israel. And we'll go through oh, and that was in Nigeria, and precisely in the Northeast region that Israel's been working on that. Oh, and Isagal, yours continues a bit further down, sorry. So Isagal's also worked on advocating to change the name of the Day for People with Disabilities to the Day of Awareness Towards Disability. And this day on the 3rd of December is known as Awareness Day and is in Turkey. So brilliant, thank you, Isagal. And then, and I may be mispronouncing this, but Murshid Akhtar has advocated to include all children, especially children with disability sports within schools. Ron has advocated for getting the blind and visually impaired introduced to the empowering sport of judo. And finally, Alexandra has been encouraging health clubs to make their space more inclusive and use the UFIT model in US and Irish clubs, which I think we came across in the last webinar. And there's some good responses also, Isagal, to that idea of changing the name of the International Day. You've got some support there too. And finally, before we go back to Amy, just from Snay, who's part of our organising committee. So for Image, for SNAE's Sport and Disability Programme. It was changing communities through cricket. So the mixed ability team has played matches with non-disabled teams and won 88 out, played 88 matches and won 61 of them. So I was hoping you'd come in with that example, SNAE, because I remembered that from our discussions previously. So what we'd love to do, unless there are any objections, and do write in if so, is to share these examples after the webinar. We'll put them in as part of the follow-up, because it's really, really interesting to hear from you all. If we had more time, we'd get you all in to talk about this a bit further, because the variety is fascinating there. But at this stage, we're just keen to get an idea, get a feeling for what you're all doing and the kind of advocacy that could take place. So brilliant, thank you all for engaging with that and with the poll. I do notice a question in there too. It's from an anonymous participant, the name's not come up, but just about how one becomes an advocate, and we can come to that in the Q&A at the end. So thank you all for your involvement there. And Amy, if I could now come back to you to go into the next section of our presentation on how to advocate.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for everyone's comments. They're all really good examples, and I would love to answer that question in the Q&A. But for sake of time, and because one of our speakers that's going to join me in this session has to leave in 15 minutes, I'm going to try and run through why it's important to develop an advocacy strategy and what it entails. And then I hope we can get started on an exercise, and at least Eli, before he leaves, could hopefully introduce that exercise. So if you could pull up the why is developing an advocacy strategy recommended slide.
Yeah, I can do that. And just to let you know, Amy, so the power mapping that Eli was going to come in to talk about, I'm not sure if we were going to do that as an exercise in the end, just as to get a bit more information from Eli, if that's okay. Just to,
I do have more information here, and if he can't
perfect.
join, then I will, but if he joins, that's better. So let's
Awesome.
see how fast we can get through this. There are 5 points listed here on developing it, and basically why. You can read them yourselves if you have access to the slides, hopefully. But essentially, a strategy is a way of understanding your situation, who's critically involved, who needs to be involved, how they relate, who has more power to create change, and then what are the entry points, the processes, the actions that you need to take, and then you go ahead and set some goals. So we put in here 8 steps to develop a post-2015 advocacy strategy. That's one example that's been given. We also have on the next slide, what does UNICEF's advocacy toolkit suggest in terms of steps? And what are things to think about? And I think it's a better concrete review of what you want to consider. So obviously you're looking at the context, you're looking at time, you're looking at organization and risk. But there are these 9 questions that you're going to have to consider. So what do you want? You know, what is the situation, and what is the problem, and what do you see as the solution to that problem? And I think this gets at how does one become an advocate? Well, it's really looking at what is the current situation, and what do you want to try and solve? Number 2 is who can make that happen? And this is where we're going to give you an example of power mapping. Number 3 is what do they need to hear? Number 4 is who do they need to hear it from? Is it you or someone else? Maybe with more power. Number 5, how can we make sure that they hear it? 6 is number 6 is how can we make sure they hear it? So not sure what happened there. Number 7 is what do we need to make that happen? Number 8 is how do we begin to take action? And number 9 is how do we tell if it's working? So I'm going to pause and see if Eli is available to walk us through the power mapping, not as an exercise, but as a explanation. Would you like to do that, Eli? Do you have time, Eli, or would you like me to do it?
Yeah, no, I just want to make sure you could hear me. Yeah, I'm happy to just share very briefly as he's as Tom pulls up the power mapping. Excellent. So yeah, just briefly, we thought it would be a great resource to share the power mapping framework for addressing an issue and a problem, solving and leveraging relationships and networks, really thinking about who's an influence, who you're targeting, and the ways to put that into motion. Um, some of the steps for that to think about are, as we've talked about already, identifying the problem, and then really looking at mapping the institutions involved, the individuals associated, looking at the power lines, and then really thinking about how you're targeting priority relationships and then making a plan. Um, for me, and over the years, I feel like the one thing that I've really taken away from advocacy is this power mapping. It's very simple. It's very just making sure you're putting it on paper, drawing these lines, and really having a plan. But it's a great resource and a great way to concretize advocacy. So thank you so much, Amy, and looking forward to the rest of the presentation.
Well, could I just a couple of questions actually there, Eli? Do you have any? I'm putting you on the spot because this is not a pre-planned question, but do you have any examples of power maps that you've created? Not to share right now, but just be curious to see how they come out because they look quite creative
Yes.
processes.
Yeah, I think
Just it,
all the time with various organizations or initiatives, whether it's addressing a school system, whether it's looking at a athletic facility, and then it's really thinking about people within that institution, people within the community, other stakeholders, and then yeah, just putting it down on paper and really thinking about how that advocacy is going to work and who needs to come to the table to be able to make it happen. And so it's sort of a visual representation, but thinking about those concrete examples of what you're advocating for, and then just trying to map how to get to reach your goal. You have your problem, but then who are those stakeholders that can really help to make the solution? So yeah, I have many different power maps from over the years.
I thought you
Um,
might, yeah.
yeah, no, and I just think it's a really helpful tool, and it also is creative, and it's sort of empowering because it allows you to think about who can you create relationships with, who do you already have relationships with, and it kind of is like a roadmap for what is possible. And but everything that's been shared up to this point by Amy, it also speaks to this. The previous tools have all it's all really interrelated, but this
Sure.
one is a great resource. So yeah,
Eli, there's another example that we could give, which is our current thinking and brainstorming around how to influence the IOC's current agenda. Do you want to touch on that as an example?
sure. Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, one example is that there's a policy, Principle 6, which is the international inclusion diversity policy of the Olympics. And that policy doesn't currently include disability within the language. And so thinking about how do we get there, who do we need to talk to, what kind of, who can be allies, who do we already know that would support this, and then putting the map together to think about that kind of change. We saw the change happen. The same policy was changed to add sexual orientation in 2014. And so now, how do we think about that same policy for disability, and who can help us with that? Who are the different stakeholders? So yeah, thank you, Amy. That's a good example.
And just finally on this too, Eli, there's a guide that you've sent me just before. Just it's a Bono curriculum guide, which looks really good. So just to is that one that we can share, or is that
Yeah,
after the webinar, just on the steps for how to use power mapping?
yeah, I think the reference that you have here is also really good, the power
Great.
mapping for
Oh
change. And
yes.
then, but the one that I sent over is also another great resource. So
Okay.
yeah, I think they're
Yeah,
both
we will
really,
share them after the
really
webinar.
good. Yeah, for sure.
Brilliant. Thank you, Eli. Thanks for jumping in. We squeezed you in before you got to drop off, so much appreciated.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Good stuff. So, Amy, is it all right to come back to you for the final part of this this section? Oh, Amy, you might still be muted there. It looks like you're not sure if you've realised, Amy, that you're muted.
Hi, Tom. I
Hi there.
I was muted. I was having a hard time hearing the end of it, so I just didn't know
Ah,
if you would be able to hear me.
no,
But
you are
if you
back.
can hear
We've
me,
got
I'm
you back.
carry on.
And we can hear you,
Okay, great.
so all good.
And also just self-advocacy. If you were a person who wanted to change, you know, the rules on in participation, for example, you would do the same thing. You would look at who you would influence and how, and what power and who you need on your evaluation advocacy, evaluating advocacy. Well, sometimes monitoring and evaluation is seen as very heavy. The truth is that with advocacy, you will end up doing it along the way, and it will be very important to assess both your progress, but also the impact that you're making. And if you regularly assess both, you will have the opportunity to revise your strategy as you go, which is absolutely critical because advocacy is an evolving process. And as this quote says on the side, advocacy strategy evolves over time and activities and desired outcomes can shift quickly. For M&E, it means making adjustments so it's more relevant and realistic within an advocacy context. And when the purpose of evaluating advocacy is determine impact, attribution is not possible. So please just keep in mind that reflecting is also part of monitoring and evaluating how your process is going. And changing course is pretty much the norm. So always think about what you can do differently to get a better outcome. So let's move on, Tom.
Okay. Oh, I would just say there are two, Amy, just because monitoring evaluation is my main background
Oh,
too. Just
please
that
go
I
ahead.
really like this this advocacy toolkit. It came from a source you sent me, but I could definitely recommend that to the group because it is a tricky area to evaluate, and there's some great resources out there. So yeah, just to mention, this is a good one. We will send these all through along with the presentation, but it's a good one to I'd recommend to read for the group as well.
Great. So we'll share some materials after. Tom, do you want to lead us through the exercise now?
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you, Amy. So, and thanks to Eli. Eli's had to drop off with a prior engagement, but much appreciated joining in there. So we'd like to now get you all a bit more involved in the webinar. We've lost a couple of people who've had to drop off. Still close to 40 of us on the webinar, so hopefully enough to go through this exercise. And again, the organising team's welcome to join us too. So what Amy will be going through just after this exercise are some lenses to look through to make the case for inclusive sport across some different areas or different lenses around social justice and human rights, around health, around business and economics, and around the social side as well. So before we go through what our team's prepared and what Amy, Sneh, Eli, and Catherine have prepared, we're really keen to hear back from you all. And if you've not been on our webinars before, we have another tool that we use just to get your feedback. And I'll just bring that up now. And it should jump up on your screen. It's a tool called Lino It. it's actually free. I think the branded version is free, or it's very cost effective otherwise. And it's just a tool for brainstorming. And the way it works is that we can drop little post-it notes onto the screen to represent different feedback. And then what we do after the webinar, as we did after the last one, is to write up the results so that everybody, even if we don't come to your response here, you're still going to be recognized in the afterwards, so your input won't be lost, and we'll be using it also. It's very good for us for our theory of change as well. And what we'd like to do is just to ask you the question, so what arguments would you make across these different areas to advance or promote inclusive sport? And so we're going to ask you about social justice and human rights. What kind of arguments could we use there, across business and economics, across social inclusion lens, and also in relation to health? So Amy, I might put you on the spot here, and apologies, but if we could borrow one of our examples that we're going to use in a moment, just to give the group an idea, for one of these lenses, just what an example of an argument might be, if that's all right, just so we've got one
Sure.
one example to go with.
No problem. I mean, I'm just going to take the far left because it's there. It may not be the most, the best example, but let's take one we've already talked about, which is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we know that it includes a specific article related to sport, and it's Article 30. So that specific text and article, which I can discuss later on, actually has arguments which governments have signed up to, and therefore have legal rights to actually implement it. And therefore, it's a good argument if you want to promote something that's in that text, then you could take that as a tool to whatever system you want to change and use it as that kind of tool. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. So what we'd like you all to do is just to type in some arguments we could use across these different areas. So what would be great is if you could, if we could start with the social justice and human rights lens. We're just going to take 5 minutes and get a couple of examples against each one. So what we're looking for first are any arguments for inclusive sport that you might have used, or you know of, or that you've come up with just now, from a social justice and a human rights perspective, as to why to be more inclusive with in relation to sport. So if you could type in your questions, that'd be great. We will be going area by area. If you want to jump ahead, then just if you could type in first which area you're writing a response for. So for example, if something has jumped into your head about health, then just type in health and then put in the argument that you might have used in the past in relation to that. That would be great. And again, if our organising team are welcome to join in too, Stay and Claire as well. So we will give it a minute or two. Just if you could type in your responses, that would be awesome. And then I'll start to bring them up as they appear, and we'll take a breather for a minute in the meantime, myself and Amy, just to while you're typing in. And just to confirm, it's to write in. You should see a question box in the panel on the right hand side. We just had 1 or 2 people ask where to write, so that's where to enter them. Just in fact, where you're asking your questions to me is where to actually put in your response. So that would be great. And we have some great examples coming through, so we're going to just start with those, and just see how many we can fit in. We've got already 5 so far, so I think it's good if I now start to bring these in. What we haven't done this time, we didn't get a chance to, is to have our big list of where you're from and the organisation you're from. So we'll just be using your first names today, but when we write this up afterwards, we'll include organization and country that you're from, because I think we again have people from a huge variety of countries on this call again. So if we could start with Aysegul, who I know is calling in from Turkey, and this is an argument on the business and economy side that will just drop in. And so the way we do this is just to bring up our post-it notes and just copy and paste in the response. So this is on the economic side, so equal budget and advertisement and media for Paralympics as much as IOC does for the Olympics, being a business or economic argument as well. Oh, I should say too, so Amy, do feel free to also to jump in at any point, just if you've got anything to add to any of the responses coming in, feel free to. So we'll come to our next argument. So that would be from Claire on the social justice and human rights side. And this comes up quite a bit in our presentation in a moment. So this is around the CRDP or CRPD and the minutes, which we do come to in a moment, I think, and around national laws, and a great change in Madagascar recently. That's a tempting. So in the Q&A, Claire, it'd be great to understand that. Again, this might be my I'm not sure if Amy, if you've come across that change in Madagascar, but it's left at a tempting point that to come back to in our Q&A to find out a bit more about that. So we'll add that into the social justice and human rights section, but we do cover looking at different treaties and laws in our upcoming final presentation. So thank you for that. And if we now come to, and we've got lots coming in now, so plenty to pick from. So thank you all for taking part. Nermin, if I could come to you next. So this was on the social inclusion side. So the more that those with disabilities are publicly visible, the more their requirements for inclusion are less, since they're now part of society, as a case to make on the social justice side. So we'll just get that one in. Brilliant, thank you. And if we now come, and it's always a bit fiddly from my side, just go from the questions into the post-it boxes, but I will get there. So if we now come, see who's next in our list. If we could come to Ron. So this is about who, I wasn't sure, Ron, which one this related to, but the IOC Paralympics, IGF, IBSA and others promote the sport of judo for the blind and visually impaired. So I'm guessing that could come, yeah, it could come actually under a number of these, in fact, in terms of who, I guess, who to involve, who to consult with, who to look to in terms of finding arguments in this area.
Tom,
But,
I'll jump
Ron,
in.
oh, Amy, yes.
I think you could put it under social inclusion, because I think there's an element of a variety of key players promoting more inclusion of sport for people with disabilities. So I think that is one place it could sit for now, but I think it does relate to multiple areas.
Great, thank you, perfect. So I've got that into social inclusion, and I've now put one of the earlier comments into the right category as well. So brilliant. So thank you, Ron, and thank you to Amy. And if we could come to Alexandra on the business and economics side of the argument to make. And so this is using some data from World Health Organization. So 15% of people around the world have a disability, and in the US, Social Security admin estimates 1 in 20 of today's youth will experience disability at some point. So for businesses, there's a sizable population currently left unserved that they could reach and they could be reaching as part of a business case. So brilliant. Thank you, Alexandra. Really nice use of stats, of statistics there too, which is awesome. And if we come to Quoc next, and this mentions, so Article 31, I'll just write this in for you all as well, just in case you can't hear me. So Article 31, statistics and data collection, to help inform the situation from a variety of surveys through a collection method. So I'm guessing there, Quoc, that's about the use of data to back up different arguments, if I'm right in that, which could fit across different areas. I don't know, Amy, where would you position that?
Um, I would put it for the moment under the social justice human rights, because it's CRPD Article 31 that they're referring to, and it is cross-cutting. It really does catch on the other three areas as well, but I think since it's a CRPD article, let's leave it there for the moment. But ultimately, it would relate to the other three as well.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. And it does seem like quite a few of these are quite cross-cutting. That seems to be a theme emerging. Brilliant. And just to follow up on Alexandra's point there, just on the World Health Organization, just a follow-up point from Alexandra, that she's specifically referring to physical activity, sport, health and clubs, but I'm sure there are other areas too that the group could be better served by businesses. So just to confirm that as well. And I don't have, we've got an anonymous participant, so feel free to also type in your name. It's still got waiting for name here. And I'm not sure who it is, but they've been very engaged in the webinar. So I'm sorry, we can't identify you, but feel free to type in your name. But they've written that they would put forward that everybody have the right to exercise, either those with special needs or normal, and must be respected. So I think I would include that under the social lens, if that's okay. So I will just drop that in there. And then also, I'm just going to come up and look for any relating to health as well. And if any of you have any health related ones within here, that'd be awesome. I think that's the main one we haven't got so far. So we'll come to Damien next, and we've got one under the human rights area. So inclusion in sport can help to undo some historic damage done to people with disabilities. So we'll add that in under the human rights argument. And I can imagine, and I have seen in doing this work, there's all kinds of examples and data that can back up that argument. So I definitely agree. And Ron, you've mentioned your earlier point would come under social inclusion, which is great. And if we come to Silvana, that'd be awesome. So we've got sport infrastructures and stadiums to include, and I'll add this one in for you too, sport infrastructures and stadiums to include in a clear and a good way, being able to see and to be with their families, the people with wheelchairs. So being able to I guess to see the pitch and being able to actually be with their families within stadiums and within sporting infrastructure, which I could think could belong in a number of places here, but as many of these responses could, but it could also come between social inclusion. I guess health might fit in there too, might also fit with economics, but we'll include it in the social inclusion if that is okay.
Tom, can I jump in?
Amy, yes, go ahead.
I just want to say that from the health perspective, what we're looking for here is, what are some arguments that you could take to a policymaker or program provider to convince them that including persons with disabilities in that program, policy, or budget would be beneficial. So that's just a clarification on what we would like to see from the health lens in terms of your advocacy arguments. And even if you don't have the data and statistics with you now, you could allude to one. You could say something along the lines of, you know, we know that physical inactivity is bad for health, and therefore engaging a person with a disability in a program would lead to better health consequences, for example. But that's what we're looking for in terms of health.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got some come through. So we'll start to drop those in relation to health. So from Claire, we've got the impact of physical activity on health is proven by many different researchers and different research around the world, certainly in the UK, that could help to support that argument. From Kwok as well, in relation to health, there's an update of the ICF requires a code for physical activity under activities. I'm not familiar, and this is my lack of background in this area on the ICF. Amy, is that something?
Yeah, it's the WHO's International Classification and Functioning framework. So it's a WHO document that is used for many different purposes.
Ah, brilliant.
And
And
if
Kwok
I have
came in
that
very
wrong,
quickly to type that into. So
okay, if
thank you,
I have
Kwok,
that
as well.
wrong, yeah, if he's referring to something else, then please let us know. But that's what I would interpret ICF as.
Kwok has mentioned in the International Classification of Function, Disability and Health, which I think from a Google search is the same thing.
Yes, that's what I was
The
referring to.
WHO. Great. Okay. Brilliant. And we're still getting loads of responses through. We can't actually get to them all. So thank you all for engaging. We'll go for a few more minutes and get as many in as we can. So if we come to Nerman now, and just again we're picking out, we're sort of building up our health side a bit here. So we've also got an argument on the health side that physical activity not only promotes physical fitness, but also has an impact on cognitive development for those with intellectual disabilities. Brilliant, thank you. So we'll add that in on the health side there, and we'll also then come back to Alexandra, and then one more on the health side from Damien, and we'll then collect a couple more before we go back to Amy. So Alexandra, no need to apologize. You've mentioned for the US related stats, but I know it's great to have some statistics in here too, so that's awesome. But Alexandra has mentioned, so sorry for all the US centric stats. CDC estimates people with disabilities are 3 times more likely to have heart disease, strokes, diabetes, and cancer, yet half of adults with disabilities get no physical activity. So again, a good use of statistics and identifying the problem.
And Tom, it's very important to have statistics from other countries when statistics don't exist in your country, for example.
Ah, interesting. So would you would advocate using?
Yeah,
So
I
using
would. I
yes.
would to some level, because there is a paucity of research in many countries, particularly low and middle income, and at times that can make it hard to advocate. So I do think there has to be a special notice that this is coming from the United States or from Europe or from any country. You know, South Africa has data, and you would just say, this is from another country, but it seems very relevant as it was a national survey and it was a result. So I would look at using advocacy or stats from other countries as long as it's used most appropriately and explained.
Ah, interesting. Thank you. Great. Well, then from Damien in relation to health, we'll take this final one on health. The disability linked to body diversity and also to body positivity movements as well. Again, as an argument to use on the health side of things too. So brilliant. Thank you, Damien. We will take one more on health because, 2 points. So Silvana's mentioned that it can be tricky with statistics at the moment, or difficult with statistics, because across countries, because each country decides what is a disability and is not always necessarily clear on that front, which I thought was quite interesting, Amy, just to mention as well. So I guess something to be aware of in
That
that
is a great
comparison.
point, and it's very valid. But I think if you give that kind of explanation up front to the policymaker, for example, and you say that this isn't from our country, it may not have the same definition of disability, but just look at some of the other indications that are out there, it can lead to a better discussion in terms of what research needs to happen in the country where you sit.
Brilliant, thank you. And if I could just drop in, just because we've, oh, and Silvana has mentioned correct with 4 exclamation marks. So there's definitely an agreement there with you, Amy, on that front. And then from Jose, we've got including all people in sport not only improves an individual and participants' physical, mental, emotional, social health, but also improves the community, their empathy, awareness, and cooperative force of everyone involved. So increasing the social health and consequently the productivity and economic power. So that actually might be where we need to, because I need to give Amy enough chance to go through the arguments our team came up with, but I really like that as a place maybe to stop the exercise, Jose, because you've started with health and then neatly crossed over into the other areas. So how health could be, in my interpretation of this, used as a basis to actually start to make other arguments within our chart here. So I'm going to put it on the health side, but I as you've written there, it can start to cross over into other areas too. So brilliant, thank you for that. And just before I pass back to Amy, a couple of things. So we will be writing these up, and all the responses and sharing them with you. So don't worry if you've not had a chance to come into this exercise. And I did want to mention, so the anonymous participant who's it's not showing up their name, just that you know, all know that's Ari Yusa from Indonesia. So welcome to the webinar, and sorry if there was a glitch there in a problem there in being able to type in your name. So I would just say thank you for all engaging in that exercise. I realize we're trying to keep track on it and get it all up on the screen at the same time, so it can be a bit hectic, but really interesting to get your viewpoints and start to go back and forth between them. So what I'm going to do now, we do have the Q&A, so if you want to pick up on in about 10 minutes time on any of these different points and debate them a bit further with Amy and Catherine and Sneh, with the full team, we're all going to be there in 10 minutes. But if I could now come back to Amy first of all, just to go through the lenses and the value propositions, the arguments that the team came up with, led by Amy on this. So Amy, would it be all right to bring you back in on this?
Yeah, by all means. So on my clock, it says we have about 6 minutes to go until we would love to do Q&A, which means I'm going to build on what was already said. I'm going to try not to repeat anything that was already posted, but apologies if I do. I also will not read or what's on every slide. I will try and summarize it because you will have access to this later. And I think that's a big point here, is that what we're providing you with could be potentially some arguments that you take into your work, but it also may not be totally relevant. So just in summary, I'm going to go through the 4 areas. So if we start with social justice and human rights, we took a big focus on conventions and international treaties and frameworks. And I will also tell you that you're going to receive an article that is still in draft, but we're going to finalize it. Catherine Carty from the UNESCO chair is working on this document that will go into much more detail in this section as well as the other 3. So please be patient with us. As soon as it's ready, we will send it out to all the participants, and then you'll have that in writing to use in your work. So the CRPD, we just want to put up here what the text of Article 30, Section 5 reads. And the reason is because it has quite a bit of content that you can use. And for those of you already using it, fantastic. For those of you who didn't realize that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has this text, please consider how to use it. Of course, you need to check and see if your country has been a signatory or if they've actually ratified this convention. But either way, it lends a really strong argument for you to look at what rights do people with disabilities have to sport. So it encourages and promotes participation in mainstream sporting activities at all levels. It ensures that people with disabilities have an opportunity to organize, develop, and participate in disability-specific sporting and recreational activities. So it gives both options as rights, and on an equal basis is really important with people without disabilities. It also says to ensure that people with disabilities have access to venues around sport, recreation, and tourism, to ensure children with disabilities have equal access to other children. And I will mention specifically here that the Convention on the Rights of the Child has an article about the right to play, and it mentions children with disabilities in the preamble or in the outset. And then the CRPD also says to ensure that people with disabilities have access to services from those involved in the organization of recreational tourism, leisure, and sporting activities. So you have this text summary of what's in the article, and there's a number of other frameworks and treaties like the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women that specifically mentions sport. So let us look now at the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I don't have enough time to go into everything about what the Sustainable Development Goals are. There's a lot of information online, but they also are directly related to what's called the Agenda or 2030 Agenda. Essentially, these are 17 global goals set by the United Nations and 169 targets within those goals. You should know that sport is formally mentioned in the preamble as an important enabler of sustainable development and a contributor to development and peace. And it goes on and talks about it as a vehicle for advancing social inclusion, health, and education. So the governments globally have acknowledged that. There is disappointment as sport is not explicitly referenced in the goals and the targets. But there is a fantastic article that looks at how sport and sport for development can help to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and we will make sure to share that with you. And there are many examples of how this can be done. So they're in that document. I'm going to quickly move on and skip the question, Tom. Can I see the next slide, please? Great. So the business and economic lens or arguments, we have these 5 points here. Essentially, there is research out there that shows that active and regular participation in physical activity can reduce the incidence of secondary conditions and non-communicable diseases, which would then enable people with disabilities to continue to engage in employment. And I think that's important, and there's much more detail and level into those statistics, but essentially saying that when people are healthier, they're able to be more employable and contribute more to society and rely less on the government support. And that's not just for people with disabilities. We also talk about statistics for children that are out of school, and sport can provide the unique opportunity for teaching life skills, which could then lead to employability or participation in society. I'm not going to read the others, but I do think it's important to yourself read them right now, and I'll give you a second to do that. So valuing diversity will benefit all, and I think that's the take-home message, that if we get it right for people that are persons with disabilities or more marginalized or more vulnerable, then we will end up leaving no one behind. And that goes back to also universal design and universal access. It's the same concept. Social inclusion. I really like what the Australian government produced and what they've shared. And it's not 2018, sorry, it's 2013, but I think it's still very relevant. At the individual level, it provides opportunities for social interaction and helps to build confidence, self-esteem, and a positive self-image. And there's plenty of research to show all of those aspects. Whether it's in your country or another country, there is research. So at that level, the individual level, there is an argument. And at the community level, we know that sport and development can be used as an effective platform to deliver messages about inclusion and the rights of persons with disabilities. And it creates those opportunities for people without a disability to encounter, interact, to really participate alongside people with a disability in a positive context. So these are very summary arguments, but I thought that they really capture the essence of what you would be using in your arguments around social inclusion and the importance of it. Next one. The last one is going to be on health. And you touched on some great points before. So in summary, we did talk about what physical activity, the impact physical inactivity can have on health and how exercise can actually prevent chronic diseases. And here there was a study done that looks at it as being as effective as medication. People with disabilities are 3 times less active than those with disabilities. We heard that, or a similar one about the CDC, and that of course impacts healthcare costs. We also know from another study that children with disabilities are less active than their peers, and that women with disabilities are less active and even inactive at a 93% rate. All this to say that your arguments could be around the more people with disabilities, children, women, all ages across the lifespan participate, the more positive impact it's going to be on the overall situation in communities and systematically. We also are looking at that exercise. Well, I've already discussed some things around, or I think I talked about secondary conditions. If not, you can read the third point. And the physical inactivity, healthcare costs. The Lancet published a study, and I would imagine it was definitely a worldwide study. I'm not sure which countries it covered at this moment, but you can see the numbers there are staggering. And I don't think you need to present the numbers as a absolute statistics. What you're trying to show is that there's a relation between physical inactivity and rising healthcare costs. So I wanted to ask, we will share some more documents on this, and I wanted to ask if there were other frameworks and other arguments that we missed, but we did the exercise already. So I'm going to end there. It has been amazing to be able to share what I know about this topic with all of you. And I believe we're going to go into question and answers. And I'm looking forward to it because I saw many of your questions already.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. And I left you with a bit less time than in the agenda, so thanks for powering through that. I always get a bit carried away during the exercises, so sorry you had to zoom through it, but much appreciated. And I'm also, just before we start the Q&A, I'm just going to bring in both Sneh and Catherine from our team just to also just both as organisers, so they can jump into the Q&A as they wish. So before we go into Q&A, I realise that some of you will need to drop off at this point. You're more than welcome to stay. All I'd say is that we are going to follow up from the webinar early next week with the recording, with the resources, with the presentation. We are finding that there's more people really watching the webinar than there are actually attending it. So these do go out to all kinds of networks, and recordings are quite key. But for you all, it'd be a chance to listen back to anything that you missed, and also to go into more depth as well. So for those of you dropping off at this point, thank you. But also anyone else, feel free to stick around for the question and answer section for the next 25 minutes. And if you have a question for the team, I'll only be dealing with any technical questions about the webinar, and it will be Sneh and Catherine, of course Amy, who will be responding. If you have a question, please just type it into the question box. We could also try bring you in on audio too. So if you would like to come in on audio, you can raise your hand and we'll bring you into the call and see if you can ask your question directly. Feel free to do that too. And we will actually start, as you're typing in, we're going to start with some of the questions that came through before the webinar, perhaps one or two of those, so that you can then come in, have time to write in your questions. So we're actually going to start with a question from Dineo, who's a freelance writer for The Guardian in the UK, who's not on the call with us today, but hello Dineo, if you're listening back, because it's a really good question. So this was, how do you advocate for inclusion without stepping on anyone's toes? And we had a chat on that beforehand, and Sneh, I think you wanted to come in and to answer that question first of all. Are you with us, Sneh? Because I think you might be self-muted there. Sneh, are you with us?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
It's repeating back a lot. I don't know if this we got it was like you're in a cave and it was echoing back. So perhaps we can give that another try, and otherwise we can move on but come back to you. I don't know, Sneh, if you want to give it one more try. It was quite evocative. It was like you were in a huge cave and your voice was bouncing off the walls. Okay, well, I think, can I unmute you? Sorry, Sneh, I've just noticed, because you're in on two connections, so let me unmute you on the other connection and see if that works.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. So, and you're, I should have mentioned earlier, it came up on the screen, but you're founder of the Indibility Foundation and part of our organising team, and it was to give that, a response to advocacy without stepping on anyone's toes. Over to you on that, Sneh.
Yes, it was really because I mean, I wanted to talk about, it was a question that I really liked, because in India, where disability carries a huge stigma, and where we wanted to do a sport for development and social change program, which included sport and disability, we decided to, I mean, we had to do it without stepping on anybody's toes. We had to do it in a very sensitive, diplomatic way, because stigma for disability goes to the extent of, non-disabled literally hating people with disabilities. And since we wanted to turn the tables on how we implemented this inclusion program, which was to train our young people with disabilities to go and deliver important knowledge and information to non-disabled communities through sport, play, and physical activity, we had to do it we had to advocate for inclusion, but do it in, like I said, in a very sensitive way. So by training our kids, by training our youth, to go and deliver knowledge which was not connected to disability in any way whatsoever, but was of value to the mainstream community, they slowly built up a relationship and showed the mainstream community what they were capable of doing, without us even talking about disability until about the third year that we were into the program. And by that time, when we actually wanted to confront disability head on with that community, they had already become acquainted with what our youth with disabilities could actually do in terms of what their abilities were, what their capabilities were. And so it was much easier for us to, by the third year, discuss this sensitive issue. And so it was advocacy in a soft way, in an educational way, but and it took a long time for us to get there. But the result today is that a mainstream community that actually hated people with disabilities have come around to appreciate what people with disabilities can do, have become really good friends with our youth with disabilities. And so it works. I think it really works.
Great, thank you, Sneh, and great to have a live example as well, and in the mix. So always useful, because it gives us quite a bit more context too. There's definitely a good question, because it can be, and it's going to relate to a question from Damien, which we will come to. I'm going to come to these in order. So we've got 3 from those of you on the webinar, and quite a few from before. So brilliant. So thank you, Sneh. If we could come to the next question that's come up on the webinar today. So from Mersha Bakhtar, and apologies if I've mispronounced your name, because again, I have to make that apology several times in every webinar. But it's a good question. So what is supposed to be the cost of inclusive education if we transform all school sports activities to be inclusive? That links to a question, I think, from Patricia Bekir just ahead of the webinar, which was for a program that does not have any focus on this and a very limited budget. Where would you suggest we start? So I think I wanted to link those questions, because it was about the cost of I guess what is being proposed, and how to make arguments around that, or how to get over that. Amy, could I come to you for that, maybe?
Sure.
Any thoughts?
Tom, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yeah.
So I think my audio may have just cut out, and if that's the case, I'm going to suggest that Catherine answer this. Oh, no,
we can hear you, Amy.
Okay,
you're there. Yep.
Okay, it's back. So just briefly, I'll start by saying that so much of the cost depends on what kinds and types of activities you are undertaking. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, what is the population that you're working with have in terms of impairments and in terms of facilities to begin with. And so it's very much a case-by-case basis, the costings. But what I would suggest is that there are very minimal solutions and cost-effective solutions on how to include people with disabilities alongside their peers, on how to do that with low resource settings. So the cost should not be prohibited. It should possibly determine what kinds of activities that you're undertaking. Catherine, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree with you there, Amy, in that I think it's about creativity as well as cost, and often the costs are not as prohibitive as people perceive. So I think that's often one of the matters that's put forward as a barrier, you know, not just across a whole range of domains in sport and physical activity. When people are first considering implementing inclusive practice, they perceive that the cost of this, from the point of view of maybe equipment and training of staff and everything else, is going to be a barrier. However, some, you know, research conducted mostly in business environments, actually, as they relate to mainstream business, but could definitely be applied to businesses that are involved in sport and physical activity, is that inclusion is not as economically costly as we might think. And it's often about the creativity of the service provider in creating options to enable that inclusion to take place, whether it's about adjusting the equipment or the environment environment or the rules or, the teaching of the resource. There are many ways in which we can make practices inclusive that don't necessarily incur a cost. Sometimes they do incur a cost, but I guess going back to the whole argument about advocacy, it's not just around people with disabilities, it's around including all people and creating that more universally designed environment that is of benefit to all of us. So it's not just a cost imposed by people with disabilities wanting to participate, so to speak, it's a cost that we must all subsume, I suppose, so as society can become more inclusive. And we know that inclusion practice opens up beyond just people with disabilities to many others in the communities. So it's both a responsibility that we have, but it is definitely not a cost that is too excessive or that is overly, that is as costly as we perceive. So economically it doesn't cost as much as we think, but the benefits extend far beyond enabling an individual with disabilities participate in an individual sport. So I think that's a key thing that we need to take on board as we look at. Invariably, there are some costs in most scenarios. They're not as much as we think, and the benefits extend far beyond any individual activity and individual cost necessarily. So I think that's a big thing to take on board.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And do we, between us, would we be able to suggest, because Mersha followed up about how could I find joyful for all but not costly inclusive sports to introduce in schools, and I can think of some organisations who've done that very well. So I thought maybe after the webinar I might just ask our group just for any suggestions on that, if that'd be okay, because I think we could, I certainly know of organisations doing some very good cost-effective work in that area, but that might be useful to pass over. Okay, great. So, oh, sorry, is that Catherine? I didn't.
Yeah, so some examples. There are many examples of good resources that are out there that people can share. And in relation to that question and practical resources that could be implemented, you will find some on one example of a project we work with was with FISA, the International Association for Sport for All, and on their recallgames.com website, you'll find a list of downloadable games that can be implemented. And all of those games, we've included the modification to make them inclusive in terms of the teaching, the rules, the equipment, and the environment. In addition, on that platform, you can upload your own games from your own country. The project initially was started to, I suppose, to capture some traditional sports and games from Europe, but beyond the project deadline, which was, I think, 2015, people have been able to upload their own activities and games from around the world and indicate how those games can become inclusive. So that makes it a good resource, both from the point of view of the activity, but also from the point of view of the cultural exchange that can happen. So we can look at inclusive games and activities, including dance and various different things from China, from the US, from Canada, from Africa, from Australia, wherever. And it's a good platform by which to share activities.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Yeah, it'd be great to share that. It'd be brilliant. And Claire's just mentioned, in addition to that, that she agrees with your comments, Catherine, about the cost of inclusive activities, but also that it's important to take into account all persons who can't join community programs and must be accompanied at home. So just an additional comment in there too.
Yep, and a fair comment. And there are more and more resources becoming available to enable people to engage in activities at home, hopefully for some as a stepping stone into more community activities that could be available as well.
Awesome, great. And Claire's also recommended a resource that she's come across, which, if it's okay, Claire, we can, if it's open access, we can share afterwards in our email, which is from TAFISA, TAFISA, and it's called Recall Games of the Past, that Claire's used, which she recommends. So we'll include that in our, if we can find that, Claire, if you can send us a link for that, we can include that in our email as well. That'd be awesome. We're going to come to two questions before we finish, just that have come in. We'll come to Damien, to your question next. So Damien's asked, can you talk about suitable context for particular lenses? For example, health seems like a safe argument or a common argument, but does social justice sometimes come with a bit of a backlash? Question mark. Would anybody like to take that question?
Can I come
Sure,
in?
Catherine. Yes, please do.
Okay, I fully understand the argument here, and I think this is a very important question, actually. And I think this sometimes reflects back on, you know, original advocacy, and also the advocacy activism issue, maybe to some extent, and how we need to be careful how we advocate, and not necessarily be overly, I guess the term is, militant about our advocacy methodologies, because I think that question reflects sometimes the negative assumption that can come with rights-based advocacy that's very hard and heavy-handed. You know, there are mechanisms around methodology for advocacy that don't have to be quite so, I guess, forceful, but at the same time getting your point across around the fact that this is a definitive human rights agenda, and it is something that we need to meet under that guise. So I think advocating by using those facts in a way that shows positive example as well, as opposed to always being very negative about what we're not providing, more so about what we can provide, and can provide effectively, and can provide at costs that are seen as reasonable, within the reasonable accommodation requirement, there is very important. So, you know, be that connected with health agenda and or any other, it's very important. Also, the cost of health related interventions, including those in physical activity, if done via certain avenues, can be extremely costly. So therefore, for example, I'm taking individuals with disabilities who engage with physical activity under a treatment methodology in mainstream health avenues. That mechanism can be very costly versus engaging in similar activities in a outside mainstream health services, so into community sport, physical activity, and other provision there, where the cost it tends to be very much lower. And the actual social justice and human rights agenda is probably much more in parallel with that offer, because people can be included in group activities or in activities that are happening in the community. So the spin-off benefit of that versus the spin-off benefit within a health service context is way higher. So engaging people in, you know, the comment earlier from Ron Peck on the blind judo initiatives, or the inclusive fitness activity. They're activities where people can get embedded in clubs and offers within their community, and there were other examples cited as well. So there's many spin-offs to those, and therefore, you know, you can look at the cost benefit analysis of those offers. But definitely, I think it also gives that message around the importance of advocating effectively, using your human rights and social justice messages effectively in your advocacy campaign.
Brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. Much appreciated. Damien's said the same thing, so fantastic. Thank you. That's great. So we'll come to perhaps one more question, and then we'll wrap up for today. But again, as I mentioned earlier, what I'm quite keen to do is, with a bit more of a gap before the next webinar, to start to take a closer look at questions we've not been able to get to. But if we could come, so Claire, I think we might have covered this in your follow-up question, but this is about the provision of APA opportunities for persons who can't access any club or place, so at home or in institutions where inactivity may be linked to a lack of transportation or financial support, which I think Catherine, we came to in because then Claire followed up, so we did mention that in our earlier discussion, I think. So if we could come maybe actually to Ari to finish, if that's okay, Claire, if we could come on to Ari's question here. So in Ari City, there are some special schools for disability students, but there are still few skilled teachers who want to teach disability students. And this is in Indonesia, I think Ari mentioned earlier. So question is, how is a good approach? What is a good approach for a teacher to teach well? Are there modification games for disabilities? And if so, could we provide those programs? So this is about, I guess, introducing disability or more inclusive sports and activities within schools. Any thoughts from our
Tom,
team
I
on
would
that?
like to jump in. This is Amy. Just briefly
Great.
to say that it's a very, very valid question, and it's one that we could talk about for an entire webinar session. And I believe that is something, or how to start to plan for more inclusive activities. And I think from an advocacy point of view, you know, you could really work on educating teachers about how to do it once you have more examples or learn more through a future webinar. And you would, you know, try and show them and convince them with all the different influences that you need in the community that this is not something that's terribly difficult or hard, and that it has good and positive values. So I would say there's some advocacy in here that we could do to then get them ready when we do pass on some skills, which Tom, would you like to comment on whether this would be potentially one of the future webinar topics?
Could well be, yeah. I think what we'll do on that front is, because we've got that extra bit of time now, is to yeah, just consider what the next, say, 3 topics could be to the end of the year. The final ones are sort of wrap up. Do we have 2 more? Do we have 3 more? 2 more. I'm losing track. But we will how many more we've got. I think there are 3 more. Then we yes, this would definitely be a potential topic. I think it's really practical, which I like, and what we're trying to go for here.
Can I come in briefly, Tom?
Sure, please.
On that last question, and I think Amy is right, and this is where teachers can also look to, and initiatives can look to empower teachers to teach them how to do the inclusive element, as opposed to all the time just what specific examples to do. So, you know, building on Amy's point, which can be a future webinar, there are a few models of how to do this, and encouraging teachers to embrace that creativity, look at the games and activities that they do, and apply a few models to them to enable them to make the activities inclusive. So we have like the tree model, the step model, the times model that teach you how to adjust to the activity to make it more inclusive. And in doing that, you empower the teacher to become, I guess, more creative with the tools and the activities that they already have, just showing them the methodology to adjust it to make it more inclusive to all people. And I think that's what's important. It's like that give a man a fish analogy. I think that would be a really important one, because there are plenty of resources which we can share about specific activities, but often it's the activities that you use yourself, that you like to use yourself, to just give you the little tools to modify them. And teachers can empower each other and can be advocates for embracing that inclusive message among their own communities of practice if they look at that methodology.
Great, thank you. Oh,
Tom,
yes, sure. Sneh, is that you?
I run a boarding school for children with disabilities, and the way that I started implementing inclusion or understanding was, first of all, even though it started off as a school for children with physical disabilities, I started including non-disabled children in the school. They started coming in as day scholars. So that started to help on the inclusion front, getting to know each other, disabled and non-disabled. And then what I also did was to employ actual teachers with disabilities. So again, the non-disabled teachers could learn how the teachers with disabilities were working with non-disabled children and children with disabilities. And getting those groups together became really, really key to every at every level understanding how actually there weren't that many differences, and they could all actually work together in the classroom, out in the playground, in sport, on the academic front, at all levels, really.
Great, thank you. And but also they're engaging with, you mentioned, with teachers with a disability as well. So that was a key part of it.
Absolutely. And many of those teachers actually ended up being our ex-students who we took through primary, secondary, senior secondary school, then put them through further education, send them to teach training, and they came back as trained teachers.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
Interesting. Thank you. Well, no, it's great to get a live example in the mix as well. It really helps. So yeah, so thank you thank you, Sneh, and thank you, Catherine and Amy, for all your responses. Just to say we've got some other suggestions of resources, or here, so Claire mentioned I guess we're currently working on international diploma on inclusive physical activity and sport using new technology, so online courses. So it'd be great to know a bit more about that. If there's any details you can share in an email with us, Claire. And Ron mentioned the Blind Judo Foundation, that they produced a parent's guide to judo to inform and dispel any misconceptions about putting their child into a sport like judo, which has been really valuable. And again, Ron, if that's available to share, just pop that on an email to us, or you have a link, that would be awesome too. It'd be great to collect some of these resources that you found useful and then refer them out to the wider group. As we all know, there's a much wider group um, beyond those of you remaining on the webinar now that have registered for the first two webinars. So I think we'll need to stop there. We're a couple of minutes over our time. So thank you everybody who's attended the webinar and is listening back, but also to those of you who've still 20 of us who've stuck around right to the end of the call and listened in to everything, and who've contributed, which we really appreciate. And it's just really inspiring to hear from all these viewpoints from around the world. So I guess finally, just some practical next steps. We're going to follow up next week with an email. We always edit the video a little bit and just tidied it up, not to remove any content, but just to get it starting at the right point, etc. So we will edit that, get it out to you next week with the resources we've mentioned. The other thing I wanted to mention as well, Candace, who I think is still on the call with us, asked last time about sharing the contact details of the full group. What we're going to do on that, now we have 2 months before the next webinar, we're going to quite soon get out an email to everybody who's registered for the first 2 webinars, which I think is probably over 200 people now, and just ask them, more explicitly if they're happy to share their details and receive further information about webinars, and so we can actually start to share with the overall group who you are and where you're from, which I think really helps when we come into the webinar. So we are moving on that, and we will get back to you all also on the topics for the next webinars, and we have our dates there, but just so you all know what we're doing next, which will be in July, the next one. So thank you all again for attending and for your input. Many thanks to Amy for presenting today, and to Catherine and Sneh and Eli for all the preparation and help, and for jumping in as well. So just remains for me to just sign off and hopefully see you on the next webinar. So have a good remainder of the day and weekend.